Welcome to the Pathfinder podcast, where we examine the paths of those that have gone before us and use this knowledge to smooth the process of forging our own path. Today is April 22nd, 2024, marking the 20th anniversary of the day we lost Pat Tillman. I recommend you go to our YouTube channel to view this podcast and check out the imagery and videos that I think you might find inspiring.
And now to Pat Tillman, the former football star who was killed yesterday in Afghanistan. It makes a difference when someone well known to the public dies.
Within the past 24 hours, Tillman lost his life while on a mission with the Army Special Operations in Afghanistan.
Today, coming at you is somber salty. Today is the 20-year remembrance of the loss of Pat Tillman. Why am I making this episode? I find myself at Arizona State University every day seeing the mark and imagery of Pat Tillman right in front of me. Listen to episode 1, which covers my connection to Pat Tillman, and you'll see some of the details on how I have an affinity with Pat. This year I worked at Pat's Run, and it was an amazing event. More than 20,000 people in attendance, traveling from all over the United States and some from outside of the United States to come and remember Pat and celebrate the legacy that Pat Tillman has left on Arizona State University and the United States. Americans are viewed in the world as courageous, charitable, and kind. Why is that? A few years ago, I visited Normandy in France, and I specifically went to Pointe du Hoc, where the Rangers climbed the cliffs to push back the Nazis and eventually free Western Europe. The people of the cities and towns around Normandy fly the American flag, the British flag, and the Canadian flag every single day in honor of the Allies liberating them. In 1996 and 7, I served as a peacekeeper in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Just last week, I ran into a lady who was a refugee from Bosnia, and I had a long discussion with her about her travel to getting to the United States as a refugee and the impact that American soldiers had on her and her family in liberating her people from the siege that surrounded Sarajevo. During my time in Bosnia, I came to know and love the people. They're extremely gracious, and on my first day in Bosnia, I was invited into somebody's home and they fed me, and I tried not to eat the meal because I know they had very little food, but my interpreter told me if I didn't, I would offend them. It was such a wonderful blessing to be treated so kindly, and I knew I had to return the favor. One little known fact in the military is there's a postal service called the Military Postal Service. You could ship packages through the military at a very low cost wherever the military planes are going. So I had my family members box up blankets, clothing, toothbrushes, toiletries, anything that they could get into boxes that met the requirements for the Military Postal Service, and I had them shipped over. And during the holiday season, I made a trip kind of like Santa Claus throughout the villages in the area that I covered as a peacekeeper and delivered these things to the families. It was a great way to finish up my tour of duty in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think these types of actions are what make Americans beloved throughout the world, and our reputation as a volunteer military is what makes others want to join the service as well. On this 20th anniversary of the loss of Pat Tillman, it feels like I'm a cat walking on a glass-top range where the burners are on. The fear of offending is great, but this remembrance is important at this 20-year point. It's important to pass on this story to the youngsters to learn and show reverence. So what was different about Pat Tillman? Pat was famous for his gonzo football, anticipating and crushing opponents. His size didn't matter. He became known as somebody to be feared on the field because of his ability to anticipate plays and take action. Later, Pat became known for choosing to sacrifice and serve his country. He's famously known as being a critical thinker and one of the early adopters of inclusiveness. One of the big differences with Pat and Kevin Tillman is they chose to serve in a time when it was an all-volunteer service in a time of war. Up until January of 1973, the United States used conscription, also known as the draft, to fill the ranks, especially in a time of war. In 1968, famously, Pittsburgh Steeler Rocky Bleier was drafted during his rookie season, and he volunteered for combat duty in South Vietnam. He was wounded during his tour of duty in Vietnam, yet was able to rehab himself and became a 4-time Super Bowl champion. During my time as an ROTC cadet, my professor of military science and senior enlisted advisor were both Vietnam veterans, and I asked them on a regular basis what it was like to be in combat. One of the things that we were required to do in the ROTC program back then was read 2 books. One was called The Red Badge of Courage. The other was called The Good War. The Red Badge of Courage is a story about a private in the Union Army who flees from the battlefield. Overcome with shame, he longs for a wound, also known as the Badge of Courage, to counteract the fact that he had displayed cowardice on the field of battle. The Good War is a book written by Studs Terkel, which is a series of interviews with various men and women from across the globe who directly experienced the events leading up to, including and during combat in the Second World War. The idea behind requiring cadets to read these books is to understand the cost of war and learning the ability to exercise judgment as a leader. After Vietnam, the military has become a 100% volunteer force. And after 9/11, everyone who volunteered for military service knew the chance of being in combat was extremely high. Pat and Kevin Tillman both gave up professional sports careers to volunteer for the quickest path to combat. I'll cover in another episode on what it means to become a Ranger. This is the path that Kevin and Pat took, and it's arduous, grueling, and not only requires physical strength, but a very sharp mind. During my preparation for this episode, I spoke with many people who knew Pat as a student at ASU or served in the Army with him. Not many people could sit down for an interview due to scheduling, or their current job doesn't permit social media or public interviews. One officer I met went to Ranger School with Pat. He served as an infantry officer, later as a Green Beret, and then went on to become an emergency physician in an elite unit for special operations.
Of 2003, I was a brand new infantry lieutenant straight out of officer basic course. Of course, everyone had heard about Pat. It was quite inspiring that someone with the kind of talent and opportunities that he had would voluntarily put those on hold to serve and protect our country. I recall that during the first week when we did pugil stick fighting, the Ranger School cadre picked out the students that did the best, had them fight demonstration bouts in front of the rest of us on a raised platform. Unsurprisingly, Pat was in one of these bouts. As befitting his history as a linebacker, I remember him smashing into the other student and driving him all around the arena. Pat and I were not in the same squad or platoon in Ranger School, and so I never had a chance to get to know him. However, people did talk about him because he was something of a celebrity. I always heard great things about him, that he was an excellent team leader and an excellent leader. The sacrifice he made still resonates with me to this day.
I usually close out the podcast with what I call dad advice, but today I'm going to leave you with just a couple of thoughts. Memorial Day is just around the corner. It's a time when we remember our fallen comrades, but I think it's also important to remember the Gold Star families bound to those fallen service members. Whether a family lost a loved one in combat or due to a training accident, it's devastating nevertheless. I would ask you to support those Gold Star families in any way you can. There are some great charities dedicated to serving Gold Star families, such as the Special Operations Warrior Foundation at specialops.org, Semper Fi and America's Fund at thefund.org, PJ and Pararescue Foundation at pararescuefoundation.org, the Green Beret Foundation at greenberetfoundation.org, the Navy SEAL Foundation at navysealfoundation.org, and many more. Use a website like charitynavigator.org to evaluate the organizations, what their giving plans are, how they do their governance, and how they've been rated by folks who've received benefits from them. Having said that, if you learned something or found something useful from this episode, reach out to us and let us know at pathfinderpodcast@fastmail.com. Please like and subscribe to the Pathfinder podcast and share the show with all those you feel might benefit from the Pathfinder stories. Make sure you check out our video experience at Pathfinder Podcast YouTube channel titled TF Pathfinder. That's Tango Foxtrot Pathfinder. This is Salty the Sun Devil coming to you from the Blaze Radio Studios at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication in beautiful downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Now go out there and find your path.